And welcome everyone. So today is all about going from a documented franchise system to a thriving system, going beyond operations manuals, going beyond standards, and getting to the implementation, implementing into your franchise system, field coaching your franchisees, improving unit economics, and ultimately avoiding that growth gap, that gap that so many franchisors get stuck in. So Kelly, I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. So am I. This is important stuff.
Yeah, so Kelly, so just phrasing it, and if you could lead the way, right, you've grown a franchise system, you've taken a system where you had no franchisees to a few and then grew it. And I know a certain point in time, you even paused sales and focused on reinforcing training and operations. Where do franchisors get stuck? And when I say stuck, where they're a franchisor, they're selling franchises, but they're not creating success. And maybe there's gaps they're missing.
Yeah, I think most of the time it happens innocently enough, but I think generally it happens with an over assumption that franchisees know what we know. And for a lot of us franchisors, we were, our founders and we were running the business first. And so I think there's a lot of assumptions that, well, of course they know how to operate this business. It's turnkey, it's easy. And it was because we created it. Like, we know all the steps because we made the steps. And so I think, that's kind of the biggest thing is we, go into it confidently. We're like, hey, they have this manual now, they know what to do. And the focus really just then goes to growth, and we forget to check in, because sometimes the franchisees don't even know they need checked in on as well. So they're not coming to us for questions because they don't know they should have them.
So Kelly, let's phrase this in we'll 3 phases, right? And let's go through each of these questions from the perspective of a startup franchisor, the perspective of I'd say emerging, right? Maybe they have 20 units, and then a scaling system where they have propulsion. If you looked backwards, and we're talking about bridging growth gap, going beyond just being a franchisor, but creating that framework for success, if we look at it from the startup perspective first, what are some of the things when you look back where you're like, I didn't understand this and I wish I would have earlier and implemented it?
I think the biggest thing, kind of what I said earlier, is that I didn't understand was that the franchisees didn't understand what I was wanting them to do. We go in with a lot of assumptions that, the people that are coming to us come with a skill set that they don't necessarily have. So for me, it was something as simple, where the light bulb went off for me was when I sent an email to the first 3 franchisees, and I'm like, hey, I need you guys to submit your P&Ls by the end of the day, Friday, per the operations manual, and they were like, okay, how do you do that? That's a good question. I just assumed you knew how to do that. So that led to me creating my first Loom video of here's how you run a P&L. And I think, as an emerging franchise, or like, that's where, we really just have to be listening and making sure we're applying those brand standards to get the opportunity to know where people need extra help, and kind of taking the time when you identify it. Like, it took me 45 seconds to create that Loom video, but I kind of didn't want to. I was like, I have a million things to do. I don't have time to tell you how to run a P&L, but it was so important. So I think that's in the beginning. As franchisors, we don't necessarily understand, or we underappreciate how much support those franchisees need, and how much time we can save ourselves in the long run if we take those opportunities to create content, so the next franchisee doesn't, have to come and ask us that.
And so, because in my mind, like, I would be confused as a franchisor, no matter the stage. So how do you balance, I have the operations manual, to what other tools you need for day to day to really make this a reality? And what's that cadence with franchisees from an operational standpoint that you look for?
Yeah, I think my biggest realization with the operations manual, and any franchisor who's gone through creating one, how how much work it is and how many hours. The first thing, like, biggest realization I had is nobody's going to read it. And that sucks, because you're like, I'm spending all this time, but most people aren't going to read that manual you give them. So, but if they are, making sure it's searchable. that was a weird, like unnecessary lesson I learned. But most people don't, want to go through all of that. And a lot of, franchisees are visual learners. So, the ops manual was great when we got started, but and we kept it updated legally. Please keep your ops manual updated. But for us, our LMS was really kind of the game changer, and making our content more accessible and searchable and available for more people on their team as well.
And Kelly, how far into the journey when did you get to a point where you confidently implemented an LMS?
For me, probably at like 5 years in, and that was a huge mistake. I would have done it earlier. I had created lots of videos. We, were kind of like most franchisors were doing in the beginning, piecing it together. So there were a bunch of videos and a bunch of documents on the Google Drive, if you could find them. And that was the problem. And it wasn't, it didn't make sense kind of where everything was stored. So, having a comprehensive place that actually took the franchisee on an educational journey, I was about 5 years in before we did that. And it definitely was a game changer once we implemented that.
Okay. And I mean, and legitimately, that's a point where franchisors are dropping the ball, right? They're coming out of the gate. They have their operations manual focused on franchise sales, and they're not building up that LMS, that durable asset that's spinning around. And that's mostly on, let's just say, that startup emerging phase. If you projected forward as your franchise system grew, what from a field support level, right? So you have franchisees out there, you now have your LMS in motion, you're growing. What's another stage where you may have hit a growth gap in terms of field training, support of franchisees, things where you wish you would have done things earlier, or what you'd like to share with everyone on this stream?
Yeah, one of the things I wish we would have implemented earlier was the auditing that we said we were going to do. And I'm sure all of you in your franchise agreements say you're going to do auditing of some sort with your franchisees, whether it's annually, every other year. We were careful to kind of change that language to, collaborative check-ins, because they really are more opportunities for us both to learn. But, in that first 5 years, you're so focused on growth, and most people are kind of hitting a stride around that time, that it's really easy to lose touch with those first franchisees and stop checking in, because we assume they've got it figured out, they got it. But that's not necessarily true, because a lot of the stuff you implemented to help people get it maybe came out after they had already launched. So they're not even looking at it. They're like, I'm already operating. I don't have time to go backwards and look at your training. And so I think, there's this opportunity to re-educate franchisees on a regular level, on a regular cadence, that sometimes we miss because we're paying so much attention to these newbies that we forget we need to re-educate or reconnect with our initial franchisees.
And what does that look like, though, that re-education, or like, how do you build that cadence as you're onboarding new franchisees, you're training them, your team is growing, sales are growing? Like, what does it look like staffing wise, operationally? Like, if we went back in time and just looked at that part of your operations, focused on supporting those existing franchisees, retraining them, what did that look and feel like?
So a big part of it, again, was our LMS. And the reason that was so important is it enabled us to require courses that had to be taken, to be recertified in, to be able to re-engage, make sure they see the newest policies. And we actually know they did it. There were quizzes and tests and things attached. So that, really helped us assign things out. But really, that is when we started really building our ops team. And so, having those dedicated operation managers who could reach out and have monthly calls with our franchisees, look at their KPIs, talk to them about new policies, make sure they know what's going on, what changes are happening. That really was the game changer that, propelled us into really knowing how to build out our systems and our communication, because that's where we finally really figured out what people weren't knowing, right? When those managers are getting on the call, those ops managers, like, hey, are you aware we're offering this promotion? Did you know that we changed this policy? It was usually like deer in the headlights, like, no, I didn't read that email. I'm busy operating a business. I didn't, do that. And so, between having a system that could track retention and those, lessons, and having a physical check-in. I mean, those two things really helped us keep people on track and helped them grow their businesses a lot more.
Kelly, how did the franchisees react to that process where you had the recertification and the continuous training and what did that relationship look like? How did they react to this?
It was a mixed can of worms. It definitely was. And a lot of our original franchisees, particularly, weren't that wild about it. And so that's like the main reason when I say if I could go back and do it differently, I would have. I would have started that from the very beginning, that expectation from the very beginning. Because I said most of us already say in our franchise agreements and our FDDs, we're going to require all these things. So we should just require them. We should put in the work in the beginning to make that the expectation. One of the things we did that did make it a little bit more palatable was providing a lot of content to them that they could use for training their employees. Because 5 years in, a lot of our franchisees were in a growth phase as well. And LMS can help us have ways where they could assign courses to their employees. So we're not assigning them, we're not crossing that legal barrier there. But they definitely saw some value of, oh, I'm going to take this recertification so I can then assign it to my employees, and that's going to grow my business. So whenever possible, there were some things that were like, this is just a policy, you have to read it and sign it. But most of it, we went out of our way to show them how this would build their business once they completed this course or, finish this series. But not everyone's going to be happy, but that's kind of the rule of franchising, I think.
And Kelly, just because I think this is great insight into the day-to-day. If I looked at categories of things you were focused on in that continuous training, so my questions would be, one, how frequent was this? A quarterly thing? How often were you interacting with these training modules and certification? And then if there were buckets between marketing, operations, customer service, what were the categories you were focused on?
So we aimed for at least monthly updates. Some of them were quarterly. There wasn't always something going on, but there was always, hey, next month is Autism Awareness Month. Here's how, as a brand, we're going to focus on that, gear that towards our marketing. So we always had very real-time relevant content, which was helped keep people engaged. But we also allowed our vendors to participate there. So to your point, what were the categories? Our marketing team, who did all of our digital marketing, they also could put up content. They also could, make announcements and show here's how to log into your dashboard and see, your ranking for the month. And so it wasn't just us creating content, which helped because it is a lot of work. There's a lot of lift there. But to your point, it was definitely business operations, marketing, for us, the actual service we were providing, training, HR, I'm trying to think what else we had there, safety. So, those big, things that would affect their day-to-day business. So they could go in, click through, search, retake classes based on those categories.
Yeah, and there's some interesting things there. You'd mentioned, Kelly, something I want to dive into. You'd mentioned they could log in and see their ranking. Yes. What ranking so what were those rankings? Because that's a question comes up often, right? Well, our clients will be like, can we share data? Can we publish system-wide data? And, a lot of times my answer is that's the whole point of a system, right? If we create benchmarks and a rising culture, what are some of the rankings, or how did you approach that sharing system data and the rankings you're talking about? I don't know what information that is.
Yeah, so we, we're really cognizant of having rankings that everyone could meet. I've worked with other brands, seen other brands where they come in and it's gross sales. Everyone's chasing the highest gross sale. And that's just not attainable. Not all markets are created equal. Someone might have 30 units, someone might have 2. And so, we were careful to also say this location got the most reviews this month, because that is something we tracked as a brand. This location brought on the most, unique clients of this type. This location hosted the most events. And so, those kind of benchmarks that were unique to our brand, we celebrated. Sometimes we would even just do silly ones like, let's see which brand can train the most of this dog breed this month. just things to keep it fun and exciting. So people had a reason to log in, and other than just an assignment they had to complete. There was a messaging board, like we wanted it to kind of be like our own little ecosystem for people to be able to get in and engage, find what they needed, but also be able to communicate with each other as well.
And what did you find? Like, how engaged were the franchisees, and like, how did you deal with franchisees that really weren't engaging in that type of culture and those communications?
That's the struggle. I would say on a good month, maybe 50% of the franchisees are engaged. And that is totally disheartening as a franchisor. You put so much money and time into these things, and when people aren't as excited as you are about it, that's not fun. But for the franchisees who were engaged, and that's usually where I try to keep my focus, it was really valuable to them. And typically we would see a correlation of the people who are most engaged to also being the highest performers. Some people just don't care, and they won't care. It's the same with your marketing campaigns or any other great idea you have. You're never going to get everybody in 100%. But at the end of the day, for me, as a franchisor, it was just really important that I knew I was giving every opportunity I could, that I was holding the promises that I said I would make to give them the tools to be successful. But you can't force everyone into that success all the time.
And then sort of connected, right? One of the things where I see a lot of disconnect or struggles is bridging the gap on the local marketing. I know like franchise agreements will say that a franchisee has to spend X dollars per month, or another formula as to how much money they're spending on local marketing. We know local marketing is so critical. I know sometimes some franchisors, they're not as on track with the monthly local marketing spend and review. And so again, the theme of this live stream is like going from operations manual to real field operations and coaching. How did you approach local marketing from the perspective of how are you tracking it, checking in with franchisees, and how did you deal with franchisees that are not doing the right things on their local marketing spend?
So, we were fortunate. We worked with an amazing vendor. We still do. The brand still does. We're this amazing vendor who handled all of the local marketing for all of our franchisees. And so we could log into a dashboard at any time and see who was spending what, and the results of that. And so, we had a lot of transparency there. We didn't the first few years, and that was difficult because you ask people how much are they spending, they're like, I'm spending how much you said I had to. And I printed some flyers and put them on windows. Like they're things you have no way of really verifying. But so we were fortunate. We had a lot of transparency there. But for those that weren't spending, this is like, again, going back to your opportunities of engagement and education, we could take a location very similar to theirs and say, like, look, this is how much they're spending, and these are the results. And, so by being able to track that and share that in those individual meetings, was really helpful. And I think that's where, as a franchisor, you have to have that dedicated time to be able to identify the problems of each franchise, and hopefully have some really successful locations that you can use as that benchmark for them.
Kelly, for newer franchisors, and maybe they're not working with a vendor yet, or their industry dictates something else, where franchisees are spending the money directly. What's your advice for how to really control what's going on in the local marketing? Should they be checking in monthly? What would look, or at least be best practices for what they should be implementing? So say it's a franchise system, they have their first 2 or 3 franchisees. Like, what should they be doing, and what would be the mistakes they need to avoid on local marketing?
It's a good question. I would definitely recommend monthly check-ins. And this doesn't have to be big brotherish. It doesn't have to be, I want to make sure you spent the money. It, definitely could be more collaborative. Let's see where you spent, and let's see what those results are. Because most of our franchisees who made interesting marketing choices early on in their local markets, they thought the idea was great. And maybe it was. Maybe they thought flyers on everyone's front doors was going to be a great idea. But then so they spend $3,000 on it, and it yields no sales. but maybe they don't know how to track that. So, it's opportunities to talk through that. It's opportunities to plan for the next month's spend or the next quarter spend. How are we going to spend it? We're going to do flyers. You know what? We've tried that in 5 locations. It doesn't really work for our brand. Let's brainstorm together. Because I don't think most people have malicious intent when they're misspending their local or, but they're going to get frustrated really quick if they spend that 3 months in a row on something with no results. And then you come to them and ask them to spend more. They're going to say why it isn't working. So, being able to check in more frequently and help direct really is going to save them a lot of headache and money, and you a lot of time, like trying to get them to get excited about it again.
Yeah, I think that's so critical. We, on the legal end of the spectrum, a lot of times where I'll see this go off the rails is the franchisor will tell us, hey, this person's not spending on marketing. They have a lot of resentment toward us. They're not providing us with the reports. And because they're not spending the right amount of money, they're not being successful. But, if we backcast a little, some of the problems I see at the franchisor level is, well, we're not checking in monthly to create that cadence and accountability. We let them go 2 or 3 months, or they're not responsive, and we let that go. And then I find there's a snowball effect. And so I think it's so critical from franchise compliance, franchisee growth, franchise system health, that monthly check-in should be mandatory. And not that you ever want to default to franchisee, which we wouldn't in this case, but if they're not reporting that local marketing spend and communicating with you on it, you can't let that happen because things will get out of control. And we see that often, Kelly. And it's usually after the fact. It's like the problem already exists. We'll fix it. And so many franchisors fall into that situation.
And I think it's fair. I mean, it's understandable that it happens. As a new franchisor, we're overwhelmed too. But I think, for me, the really defining moment, if we mentioned I stopped growth and I'm like, no, we are reevaluating, is I had forgotten for a moment that a lot of people purchased our franchise or came in to our story because we were so relational, because we were like, we're a team, we're in this together. And at some point that monthly support became fill out this form, send it to us. If we have any feedback, we'll provide it, right? We were collecting data, we were setting benchmarks, but it was no longer a conversation.
Kelly, I'm sorry, disappeared.
There you are.
What happened? Sorry, guys. I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. My screen dropped. And by the way, like Adam out there, amazing nuggets of knowledge. Thank you. Guys, I'm so sorry. I disappeared. Maybe that's good, though. We're still listening. Kelly, thank you. Guys, that's like the worst thing ever.
I was like, I don't know if anyone can still hear me.
Kelly, I'm like, it's got to be like being in a void. Guys, I am so sorry. Oh, my God. And on replay, I'm like, I was starting to take notes. I'm like, I don't know what I did. So, and I'll get us back. Local marketing, that's where we see a lot. And here's a question, and sort of off a little, but I think this all relates, and I'll connect the dots. What are the top 2 to 3 challenges franchisees consistently face that slow down growth? And I think, Kelly, for this question, that, again, we're talking about going from operations manual, being a franchisor, to really a thriving franchise system, right? And to me, it's always the little things that are going to create success. But if franchise, when, again, on the legal end, where we see the crisis points are, franchisees are running low on funds, or they're not achieving sales, so they don't want to invest more capital, and it becomes a snowball effect. So from the perspective of a franchisee, and sharing it as you as a franchisor, what would you say are their 2 to 3 challenges that'll slow down their growth? And if I threw one out, I would say it's that local marketing, but
it is. That's definitely one. It's marketing. And, as a franchisor, we might be amazing in our market too, but there's a learning curve for us in other local markets too. Like marketing isn't created equal across the country. So definitely people figuring out what works for them in their market and us supporting one. You already mentioned this one, Charles, but being undercapitalized, is a huge, I mean, that's not just marketing, that's and also being able to hire the right people to support your growth. And a lot of franchisees are hesitant. That's another place they're hesitant to spend money to bring on staff because they might just be barely squeaking by because they invested so much to start. But if they don't add a team, they can't grow. And so they become stagnant, and that becomes frustrating. So we're throwing out all this money to get in business, and if it does work, we don't have the team to follow through with all that business. If it doesn't work, we just wasted all that money. Now I still don't have any opportunity to hire. And so, I mean, a lot of that really does go to, having franchisees coming in undercapitalized. And that's a tough lesson to learn.
You've raised so many good points. And by the way, before to Adam, guys, keep firing in questions for sure, and I'll definitely address them. So you brought up a great point, and it's something I think every entrepreneur, business owner focuses on, even for our law firm, Kelly. To me, our greatest growth opportunity in many ways, the solution is more staffing and team to provide better service, which will lead to growth. And so now, certainly from the perspective of a franchisee, you shared that where the franchisees need to have the confidence, right? Which I guess franchisor, you need to give them that confidence in that process, build up that team, grow your sales, right? Because one dissatisfied customer, one answered item leads to snowball. What about at the franchisor level? Because many times, a lot of new franchisors or even emerging brands, they have questions of like, hey, we're doing it. Maybe it's two original founders, or we're doing a lot of these things. And many times I'll get Charles, like, what team members should I be adding and where should I be bolstering my team? So if you look at the growth of a franchise and progression, for everyone listening, what would you say are core fundamentals that they should focus on hiring that team or positions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Another one, like in hindsight, I would have done so much differently. I think the most important hires are at least in the beginning, are the people that can continue to identify and build your brand. And I look at this, like if anyone could do the job, they're probably not your first hire. And I don't mean that as if like I'm diminishing anyone's like careers or abilities. But for me, for example, I was spending so much time reviewing franchisee financials and trying to figure out where marketing dollars and where I should have just hired a fractional CFO. My time was not best spent reviewing financial documents. My time was best spent building the brand, continuing to engage with the franchisees, getting them excited about building up their markets. That was where my focus should have been. It shouldn't have been screening initial applicants with FranDev. I should have hired a company that does that. There are so many vendors and fractional roles that I think, especially in the beginning, like if it's not brand specific, don't spend your time on it if you have the ability to bring someone else in. Because most people, like you talk about this all the time, Charles, especially with brand story, most people are buying you. They're buying your story. They're buying the relationship with you. They don't care who your accountant is. They don't care who, you're using for ordering uniforms. Like I shouldn't had to have my hands on all of those things, but I was. And so it really took away my focus on the franchisees. And honestly, that burnout rate is so high when you're first starting to franchise that the more you can get off your plate to focus on your brand and that growth, the better.
Kelly, the signposts and signals, right? So you're giving advice to franchisors out there and everyone on here. I appreciate as you're implementing systems, again, going from operations manual to actual field support and implementation, what were some of those early signs or signals where you felt, okay, this is working, like there's a compound effect here. I want to keep building up our LMS. I want to keep building up our coaching. Like, what would you see in franchisees that were good signals for you?
One was usage. We did have like our ops manual online. The number of people that opened it, I think it was like 3%. It was insane. When we shifted over to more video content, we could see 50+% of people are viewing and in watching. But the biggest thing that I think was a game changer for me that I'm like, we're on the right path was the request for content. all of a sudden we started having franchisees say, hey, could you make a video about this? Could you make a video helping us understand this? And so, that was kind of like the light bulb for us that this is working, and they're asking us for content now. Because before they weren't. They just, most franchisees, if they can't find the answer, are just going to come up with their own. To be honest, you have certain like franchisees you'll talk to all the time, but most of them are just going to be like, well, I couldn't find it. I'm just going to do it this way. So, I think franchisees asking us for more content was the big like beacon for us that, hey, we're putting it out the right way.
I think that's a great objective standard, right? So rather than putting it on the franchisee of, hey, why aren't you implementing certain things or reaching out to us and asking us, right? It's creating that cadence and system where you're really training them to look for those videos and look for that support.
100%. And it was cool too, because as we were doing this, we'd have franchisees like, what would be really helpful? I think they say, looking back, when I was a new franchisee, it would have been helpful if you had a video on this. And we actually got to collaborate with our franchisees then, because we'd be like, that is such a great idea. Would you like to make that video and be featured on the LMS? So then we had franchisees also making how-tos, and it was really cool. They got to see each other on there, and not just our same old mugs like over and over again. But that also really helped us grow that library once we started having our franchisees contributing to it as well.
And look, we're working on an LMS here. You've been leading the way for our clients and whatnot. And because you think about it for us on how we work with our clients, but as a franchisor, there's so many instances where you're giving good value and providing certain things and then not banking that and creating systems around it. I find the more you do that too, franchisors are going to identify more gaps versus just piecemeal. Our friend Kristen, would you say fractional fran dev is more important or comes before fractional coaching?
That's a really good question. So, I have mixed feelings about fractional fran dev. I used it, and honestly, like, we would not have grown where we grew without bringing in some outside support. I believe in a more hybrid model, though. I'm not a big fan of fran dev when you bring someone on and they take the person from initial application through signing. Like, I think the founder needs to be very involved in the process very early on. Running their background checks or credit score, no, right? Like, that's not where your time is spent. But having those conversations, making sure the culture fit is right, very important. So, for coaching, especially for doing franchisee coaching, this is definitely where I would hire. I would, bring in an employee that really knows your brand. Maybe they've worked with your brand before. Maybe they're a franchisee who's been with your system for a while and they're really killing it and they want to do some coaching with new franchisees. We had a mentor system set up also that our franchisees really enjoyed. So definitely, like that coaching side, you want someone who's really passionate about your brand and can keep people motivated. Whereas, helping screen applicants definitely is a good place to bring in someone fractionally.
I think on the coaching, your point about having someone in-house, they really need to be a brand advocate, right?
Yes.
They need to live and breathe the brand. And I feel like if was in your company, someone who works and interacts with you, that culture transfer is happening with that key employee and then that coaching. And I think that's critical, right? Because those are the guardrails for any business. Kelly has a good question. I know you have a good answer for it. What LMS system did you use?
We used Learning Zen.
And they're great people. By the way, we recently did a podcast with them. And by the way, guys, too, Learning Zen, they come to our Fran Camp conference. Everyone on this live stream, Kelly will be at our next Fran Camp conference in Chicago. Then we have one in Miami. Definitely think about coming. They're worth it. And these are, a deeper dive. But so Learning Zen, which they really are great people. And then the next question is, or the second part is, what is all interactive material?
I don't know if I understand the question, Kelly.
But I'm assuming with Learning Zen, you have videos on there. You have,
yes.
Oh, was it all interactive material?
Oh, Yeah, no, that's a great question. No, not all of it was. Some was just informational, right? Like you just might need to come find this flyer or find this social media. Even our social media posts we create for the month were there, right? It kind of became a vault, like a document vault as well. But a lot of it was, and kind of going back to that legal gate it created, and why I loved Learning Zen, I will always plug Learning Zen, is they gave your franchisees the ability then to assign training and content to their employees. As a franchisor, you choose what can be shared, like what's employee appropriate. But then that enabled them to use those same training videos to build their team and permeate the culture without us being the one assigning it out to their employees. And so, that, like, especially as franchisees are building teams, to expedite their ability to bring on new people and train them was a huge value add to our franchisees. And that's probably the biggest part that they utilized in the system, honestly, was that employee training center.
Kelly, who met, like, operationally, who was managing your LMS and updating it? And how did you as a team decide what you were doing with that? And who was keeping it on track?
So for a number of years, that was me. About 6 years in, 7 years in, we brought in like a tech person who would like oversaw all the systems. They answered all the CRM questions, the learning management questions, all of that. But to your point earlier, we had those different categories where there was ops, training. And so each department managed their own section and, would add content, update content. So it was definitely a team effort because it's a big lift off to get those things going.
And I just remind everyone, guys, any questions, just send them in and we're going to address them. But as we get ready to get to the other side of this and get close to finishing our live stream, I have a question, which, now's we're end of August, we're going to hit September. Our team's been working with our clients about at least starting the conversations about, hey, your item 19 for 2026. Let's start now looking at data, understand what you have, don't have, because we want to plan this out and have as strong of item 19, and not as strong, but also one that communicates thoroughly, right, for your franchise sales process. One thing I see where, from an operational standpoint, a lot of times franchisors, especially emerging, run into issues where they don't have the financial data from the franchisees. And this is at year end. The bigger issue is, they don't have the monthly P&Ls or quarterly P&Ls. And those are, like, to me, are very important signals to be tracking, right? Beyond even just gross sales. How did you deal with financial reporting? What was your perspective on it, whether it's from compliance or system health? How did you address that?
So I think that's another option, area where we don't know what we don't know. One, I will say, this is definitely a place we heavily utilize vendors. There's a vendor for that. QuickBooks, they actually have a system for franchisors. Well, they'll go in and set up your master franchise account. Mm-hmm. And with that, they set up what your chart of account looks like. So everyone's is uniform, and every new franchisee you bring in, they take them in, they do QuickBooks training, they make sure their chart of accounts matches yours, that, regular expenditures are being tied. So that's helpful, right? Setting the standard. Our first year's item 19 was hilarious. I mean, comparing people's chart of accounts, there was no rhyme or reason, like why this person made X dollars and this made the, half of that, but really they grossed the same amount of money. It was wild. So, utilizing someone who can set everything up right from the beginning, so important, because franchisees don't know how to do that, the majority of them. The second thing, though, to my point earlier, a 10-second Loom video showing people, here's how you set up your reports to automatically come to me so you don't have to remember to do it every month. I just assumed everyone knew how to do it. They don't. And if they didn't set up automatic billing on that monthly call and think, hey, I noticed your billing isn't set up automatically. Do you want to hop into QuickBooks together right now? And I'll walk you through how to do it. And so, it's, again, like those opportunities to catch things early and give people a solution that's quick, easy, and that they can find.
There's really good suppliers out there. Like, we've had conversations where they're coding the general ledger accounts and they're pulling the data automatically.
Right.
So, and then you create those KPIs and you create those dashboards. I think that's so critical. Not only for me selfishly, where we want to, get that item 19 data so we have a solid economic story, right? Because so many brands, they get stuck January, February, it's like an afterthought. But then along the way throughout the year, really having those indicators as they go forward. Kelly, I think we help solve some gaps here. And again, the big point is going from that operations manual to a thriving system. I think it's like anything else for every business. It turns out it's all the small things that get that flywheel spinning. So Kelly, I appreciate the time. Guys, I appreciate everyone on the live stream. I apologize for disappearing. And if, as always, if anything we could help with, always feel free to reach out. Kelly, thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles. It's been a blast.